Right now, off the coast of Western Australia, a storm that has already crossed one side of the continent, dragged floodwater through the north, and refused to die is strengthening again over open ocean. As of this moment, severe tropical cyclone Narelle is moving southwest just off the WA coast, and the next phase of the system could bring very destructive wind gusts up to 275 kilometers per hour, dangerous storm surge, and heavy rain capable of triggering flash flooding across communities spread over hundreds of kilometers of coastline. But the most important thing to understand tonight is that this is no longer a simple cyclone story. This is not a storm forming offshore, moving inland once and fading out. This is a long-lived system that has already crossed multiple regions, already caused flooding far to the east, and is now reorganizing over warm water with another populated coastline directly in front of it. And that changes the meaning of everything, because when people hear the word cyclone, most of them imagine one moment, one landfall, one impact zone, one burst of destruction. Then it is over. But that is not what Narelle has become. Narelle is moving like a chain reaction. It formed near Queensland, it crossed the continent's far north. It fed flooding in the Northern Territory. It weakened, it moved back over water, it regained structure. And now it is intensifying again off Western Australia, with a broad circulation capable of damaging places that are not all built, supplied, or psychologically prepared for the same level of punishment. This is not one event. This is one system unfolding in multiple chapters. And tonight, Western Australia is entering the chapter that may prove the most damaging. At the center of Narelle, sustained winds are already severe. Gusts near the core are extreme. But the real danger is not limited to the eye. The wind field of this storm stretches outward across a vast radius, which means communities do not need to take a direct hit from the center to experience major damage. The coast from the Pilbara down through the Gascoyne is facing a corridor of impact, not a single point of impact. That is the first misconception this storm destroys. People want to know where the eye will cross. The better question is which communities will spend the next 24 to 48 hours inside the storm's reach, even if the center remains just offshore for part of that time. And the answer to that question is uncomfortable. Exmouth, Onslow, Coral Bay, Carnarvon, Denham, communities farther south watching the forecast edge closer, small towns, tourism towns, supply towns, coastal settlements that do not all have the same level of structural resilience. Some are used to tropical weather, some are used to strong weather, but not this combination of wind, surge, and prolonged threat. Some are staring at the forecast and realizing that the category on the storm does not tell the whole story. Because a storm can weaken slightly on paper and still be moving into areas where the buildings were never designed for what remains. That is one of the most important details in this whole event. When officials and local experts start warning that many homes farther south are not cyclone rated, what they are really saying is that risk does not shrink simply because the storm loses a category label. In fact, for certain communities, risk can become more personal precisely because the storm arrives in a place less adapted to it. A Category 2 or 3 storm near a coastline built for Category 4 standards is one kind of event. A storm of similar force near older houses, weaker roofing, more exposed debris fields, and less routine cyclone preparation is another. The category can fall while the danger becomes more intimate. Now imagine what those winds actually mean. A gust of 275 kilometers per hour is not just very strong wind. It is not a dramatic phrase for television. It is mechanical force at a level where roofs begin to fail, fences become projectiles, branches become spears, sheet metal becomes airborne, windows become targets, and every unsecured object in a yard or street becomes part of the storm itself. Wind at that speed does not simply push. It tears, rips, pries, lifts, strips, and hurls. It finds weaknesses. It exploits edges. It multiplies damage by turning broken things into weapons against everything else. And the broad wind field means that damage can begin before people feel like the storm has truly arrived. That is what makes the waiting so dangerous. Because severe storms rarely announce themselves with a single dramatic moment at the beginning. They arrive in layers. First the pressure changes. Then the gusts start to pulse harder. Then the sea looks wrong. Then the rain bands push through. Then power flickers. Then roads begin to collect debris. Then emergency services start receiving the first calls. By the time the event feels real to everyone, it is often already too late to reposition, too late to evacuate safely, too late to secure what should have been secured earlier. A cyclone does not become dangerous when the eye arrives. It becomes dangerous when the margin for action disappears. And that margin is exactly what is shrinking along the Western Australian coast tonight. Take Exmouth, for example. Exmouth is not just a dot on a map in a forecast cone. It is a real coastal town with tourism traffic, fuel dependence, businesses, residential neighborhoods, and a physical geography that does not offer endless directions of escape. People there have been taping windows, filling sandbags, clearing loose objects, and preparing to move inland. Caravan parks have emptied. Petrol stations have been busy. Officials have told residents that the only safe way out is inland. That sentence matters, because it tells you there are not 10 easy options. There is a narrowing route structure. There's a growing recognition that once the outer impacts begin in earnest, movement becomes harder, not easier. And the people who live there understand something outsiders often miss. Not every cyclone feels the same. Communities that regularly deal with tropical systems develop intuition. They can tell when a storm is routine, when it is serious, and when it has crossed into something else. And by the look of local preparations, Narelle has crossed into something else when longtime residents begin reacting with greater urgency than usual, when business owners start talking not just about inconvenience, but about system strain, when emergency meetings fill up, when towns start moving like they are bracing for a real hit. That is local pattern recognition. That is experience translating forecast language into action. And Exmouth is not the only place where the storm is exposing deeper vulnerabilities. In Shark Bay and Denham, attention has shifted toward foreshore flooding and the possibility that storm tide may begin doing damage even before the center crosses anywhere nearby. Storm surge is one of those hazards people consistently underestimate because it sounds technical and distant. But surge is not just rough seas. Surge is the sea level itself rising above normal tide and being driven inland by the storm's pressure and wind. It is not a wave you watch from a cliff. It is the ocean temporarily relocating its boundary. Roads that were dry become channels. Car parks become shallow basins. Low-lying infrastructure begins to flood. Access changes. Emergency response becomes slower. Coastal homes and businesses begin dealing not just with rain coming from the sky, but water arriving from the sea. And storm tide does not need to be record-breaking to be destructive. It only needs to arrive in the wrong place at the wrong time, layered on top of strong wind, elevated waves, and rainfall, while the community is already under pressure from everything else. That layering is what makes this storm so dangerous. Rain alone is one problem. Wind alone is another. Surge alone is another. But tropical cyclones rarely deliver these hazards separately. They stack them. Heavy rainfall across the Pilbara and Gascoyne has the potential to trigger flash flooding, especially when it falls rapidly, in strong bands over roads, creeks, drainage lines, and low-lying areas already dealing with coastal effects. Rain totals of 100 or 200 millimeters sound like numbers on a chart until you place them over a town in the middle of high winds and failing access routes. In that environment, rainfall becomes a force multiplier. It undermines response. It reduces mobility. It cuts roads. It pushes runoff through neighborhoods. It drives water into places already exposed by the wind. And because Narelle has already moved across Australia's north, there is another dimension here that makes the story even larger than Western Australia alone. This storm already left a hydrological footprint in the Northern Territory. That matters, because people often think a storm ends where the clouds leave. But that is not true. The rain remains in the system. Rivers continue carrying it. Flood peaks move downstream. Catchments keep responding long after the dramatic satellite images shift elsewhere. Narelle contributed to major flooding inland, and parts of that flood story are still unfolding even as the storm itself intensifies again to threaten another coastline. That is a remarkable and deeply unsettling characteristic. One system, multiple regions, different hazards, sequential disruption. The same name on the weather map, but a changing form of danger depending on where it goes next. Which means Western Australia is not watching a new storm arrive. It is watching an already proven storm come back stronger. And that comeback stronger is one of the most revealing parts of this entire event. Storms are supposed to weaken when they interact with land long enough, when their circulation is disrupted, when they lose access to warm ocean water. That is the normal logic people expect. But Narelle moved back over favorable waters and reorganized. That tells you the environment around it has remained supportive enough to let the storm rebuild. Warm sea surface temperatures, enough structural integrity in the circulation, enough atmospheric support aloft, enough room to breathe, enough room to grow again. That should concern anyone in its path. Because a system that can survive crossing land, dragging flood impacts through the north, then re-enter open water and begin intensifying again, is not behaving like a tired storm nearing the end of its life. It is behaving like a storm that has kept finding new energy sources as it moves westward through the continent's weather machinery. And this is where the ocean matters. Warm water is not just background context in a cyclone. Warm water is fuel. It is stored energy. It is the surface layer from which these systems pull heat and moisture upward into the atmosphere, organizing thunderstorms around a central circulation and tightening the engine that drives destructive winds. When forecasters say environmental conditions remain favorable for further intensification, the plain language translation is simple. The storm still has room to get worse. Not guaranteed, but possible. And when that possibility exists, while people are already entering final preparation windows, every hour matters. That is the countdown now underway. Some communities are preparing for the possibility that the storm could pass close enough to produce severe impacts even without a perfect direct landfall. Others are watching the projected path toward Shark Bay and farther south. Emergency crews are being positioned, sandbags are being laid, ports have closed. Fuel is being discussed not as a convenience, but as a resilience issue. And all of it is happening under the pressure of uncertainty, because uncertainty is the hardest part of tropical cyclone forecasting for the people living underneath it. A forecast cone is honest. It does not pretend to know the exact future. But the human mind hates that honesty. People want certainty. They want a town name, a landfall point, a guarantee. They want to know, will it hit me directly or not? But storms like Narelle are most dangerous precisely because the question is too small. Directly or not directly is the wrong framework when a storm is this broad, this long-lived, and this layered. The better question is, will my town be close enough to experience damaging winds, dangerous seas, heavy rain, disrupted power, blocked roads, flying debris, or coastal flooding? And for a large stretch of Western Australia tonight, the answer appears to be yes. This is why older comparisons are becoming so important in official language. When emergency authorities invoke events like Cyclone Saroja, they are not doing it casually. They are reaching back into recent disaster memory to communicate that the conditions some communities may face are not theoretical. Western Australians have seen what severe cyclonic conditions can do when they push farther south into areas that are less accustomed to them. They have seen buildings damaged, landscapes altered, towns scarred, and recovery stretched over weeks and months. The comparison matters not because Narelle will reproduce every detail of past storms, but because it gives shape to the threat. It says, this kind of damage is possible here. This kind of disruption is within living memory. Do not treat this as routine. And Narelle has another feature that makes it feel even larger. Its track is extraordinary. This is a system that formed off Queensland, crossed the far north, influenced flooding across the Northern Territory, then redeveloped and threatened Western Australia. That kind of long track across multiple states and territories is rare. Storms do not usually keep writing themselves across the map like this. Most tropical systems weaken and disappear before they can redistribute risk across so much of the continent. Narelle has not done that. It has behaved like a migratory threat, changing form but maintaining consequence. That matters for retention. It matters for emergency planning, and it matters for public psychology, because each new region watching this storm is not dealing with a blank event. It is dealing with a storm that already has a history, and history changes how fear works. A town can talk itself into underestimating an offshore storm. It is harder to do that when the same storm name is already linked to flooding elsewhere, already linked to major emergency attention, already linked to road closures, closed ports, evacuations, and repeated warnings. Narelle arrives in Western Australia with credibility. It has already proven it can harm. Now add human infrastructure to the equation. In Shark Bay, power reliability is already part of the conversation. In Exmouth, evacuation, direction, and fuel access matter. In Carnarvon, agriculture could lose an entire season. Ports and energy and shipping zones have shut down. Workers have been moved. Tourists have been leaving. Schools have closed. Search and rescue resources are being positioned. These are not sensational details. They are signs that the system surrounding the storm is changing shape before the strongest impacts have even landed. That is what real disaster buildup looks like. Not one giant moment, a sequence of adjustments, closures, movement, quieted roads, busy fuel stations, empty shelves in the most exposed places, local briefings, sandbag lines, businesses boarding up, emergency crews shifting into place, the ordinary machinery of a region starting to bend around the storm before the storm bends the region itself. And then there is the deeper question hanging beneath all of this. What if the storm does not need to be maximally strong to leave a deep scar? That may be the real lesson of Narelle. People often wait for superlatives. The strongest, the biggest, the most historic. But many of the storms that leave the deepest scars are not the absolute worst storms possible. They are the storms that arrive in the wrong place, in the wrong structural context, with the wrong sequence of compounding hazards. A storm does not need to be the worst on record to become life-altering. It only needs to meet a coastline where wind, water, exposure, and infrastructure line up badly enough. Western Australia may be entering exactly that kind of moment because some of the communities now watching Narelle are not simply worried about one night of severe weather. They are worried about what comes after. If power fails, how quickly can it return? If roads are cut, how long before access is restored? If debris fields spread across town, how quickly can emergency crews move? If foreshore flooding coincides with high winds, how much of the local infrastructure absorbs it at once? If crop damage is severe, how far into the year does that impact stretch? If ports close and operations stall, what secondary effects ripple outward from there? This is the part of disaster most headlines miss. The storm itself is only the ignition. The longer story is what systems it forces into failure, delay, or fragility afterward. And Narelle has all the ingredients for that kind of aftermath. A long track, multiple jurisdictions, mixed infrastructure standards, tourism exposure, coastal flooding risk, agricultural risk, energy and port disruption, inland flood legacy from its earlier phase, a broad wind field, potential for very destructive gusts, and a public trying to make decisions while the forecast remains dynamic and the final path is not a perfect certainty. That is why the next day matters so much, because right now there are still actions available. People can still move inland, loose debris can still be secured, windows can still be reinforced, emergency plans can still be executed, boats can still be repositioned, supplies can still be checked, public warnings can still alter behavior. The margin is narrowing, but it has not entirely disappeared. And in storm events like this, those last available hours often define the difference between damage and catastrophe, between disruption and tragedy, between an impact people talk about for weeks and one they remember for years. Somewhere tonight in Exmouth, someone is standing outside under a sky that still does not fully look like disaster and trying to decide whether they have done enough. Somewhere in Carnarvon, someone is staring at crops and seeing not produce, but months of labor sitting beneath a moving atmosphere. Somewhere in Denham, someone is looking at the shoreline, at the tide, at the sandbags, at the forecast, and trying to picture how much water storm surge really means. Somewhere farther south, in towns not built around tropical cyclone culture, people are reading forecasts and wondering whether this storm will still be serious by the time it reaches them. And the answer is that seriousness is already present. It is present in the closures, in the warnings, in the emergency language, in the strain on fuel and power planning, in the movement of people inland, in the long-lived nature of the storm, in the fact that it has already flooded one region before turning toward another, in the possibility that even after weakening, it may carry damaging winds and rain farther south into places not designed for them, in the recognition that a storm does not need to be perfect to be destructive. It only needs to be close enough, broad enough, and timed badly enough. That is what Narelle is now testing. Not just roofs and roads and coastlines, but assumptions. Assumptions that the worst is over after first landfall. Assumptions that weakening means safe. Assumptions that storms belong to one region at a time. Assumptions that inland flooding and coastal wind are separate stories. Assumptions that a near miss is not still a disaster. Assumptions that a broad circulation is somehow less dangerous than a direct strike. Assumptions that the ocean's roll ends where the coastline begins. Tonight, every one of those assumptions is under pressure. And by tomorrow, some of them may be gone. Because severe storms do something very few other events can do. They reveal structural truth in a matter of hours. Which homes were stronger than they looked? Which ones were weaker? Which towns had enough shelter? Which ones depended too heavily on fragile systems? Which communities acted early? Which ones waited too long? Which coastlines were more exposed than people believed? Which emergency plans held? Which ones assumed a narrower, simpler event than the one that actually arrived? Narelle is moving toward those answers now. The sea off Western Australia is already carrying the storm's signal toward shore. The outer circulation is already doing work before the center arrives. The rain threat is already being calculated. The surge threat is already being watched. The ports are already responding. The towns are already changing shape around the forecast. The storm is no longer coming in the future tense. It is arriving in layers, in decisions, in logistics, in atmospherics, in pressure. And that is what makes this such a powerful and dangerous moment. Not merely the possibility of landfall, not merely the possibility of destruction, but the fact that one storm has already crossed so much ground, already delivered so much consequence, and still appears to have enough energy left to threaten another coastline with a fresh round of damage. The storm is not done. The continent is not done with it. And within the next 24 to 48 hours, Western Australia may discover that the most dangerous part of Narelle was never that it existed. It was that it endured.